Let me now invite to the stage Keyu. She will give us a preview of a future in which China is the first systemic emerging market to become the largest economy in the world. You're competing this morning with Martin Wolf, who in the FT has a few ideas about how it is going to transform itself. Keyu, welcome.
Economic thinking has taught us much about two groups of economies. The first is systemic countries, defined by the fact that they have substantial spillovers onto the rest of the world. The second group of economies are emerging markets, characterized by immature institutions, substantial volatility, and so these are the two groups of countries that we know, but for the first time in history, they're going to coincide in China and potentially in the future in India. So China is going to be the world's first systemic emerging market. This new paradigm brings a set of new issues to bear. The analogy is that when large ships set sail, no matter how carefully they're navigated and how skillfully they are steered, their wake will create turbulence for the rest of the world, for their other ships. And that's going to be what should happen when China opens up and becomes larger. Let's remember that the China shock to the global trading system was a one-time momentous event. It happened quicker than people expected, and its impact was much larger than anyone would have imagined. There could be a second China shock, and this time it is to global financial system. Today, China is only about 30% as financially integrated as the US is by measures of international financial flows relative to GDP. But the potency of its spillovers are already felt across the world. Now, sometime in 2015, a 2% depreciation of the RMB triggered a 25% decline in the value of the Kazakh exchange rate. The global financial markets, the global stock markets were hanging off the wall in terms of what's happening to China and Chinese global financial markets. Chinese monetary policy, fiscal policy, its deleveraging policies today are impacting the world, and even the uncertainty of its macro policies are also finding its way to affect global stock markets, bond markets, and financial volatility. And this is happening only, to the extent that China is only partially financially integrated in the world. And this effect will only increase over time when China grows and builds more financial linkages with the rest of the world. So this raises three questions for the future of China and the global financial architecture. The first is, from China's perspective, the desirability of rapid financial liberalization and integration. Now, there are two views here. One is, of course, from the experience of industrial countries, financial liberalization leads to a better allocation of resources and better allocation of capital. The second, which is embraced by Chinese policymakers implicitly or not thoroughly explicitly, is that somehow opening up forces policy normality. A country that is subject to the harsh scrutiny of global financial investors has less room for policy non-transparency, erraticism, and irresponsible policies which are easier done behind closed doors. The cost is much lower until you open up. So there's a notion in which opening up will spur domestic policies and reform. The second question is, what should the world want? And to what extent should the world say what it wants, right? Because opening up would be good for China, but would be good for the world when there's substantial more volatility. Now, I think we're wrestling with an issue, which is setting domestic policies against international imperatives. And the world sometimes has double standards on this. The US Fed policy asserts that it bases its policies on US interests, not on global interest. But of course, the US Fed has significant impact on the rest of the world. So how realistic is it that we ask China to base its financial policies on the world interests rather than their own? There's also another question in terms of what the financial sector wants, the US Treasury wants, the City of London wants, in terms of more open China, and whether that really represents the interest of the rest of the others, the rest of the people in the countries and other parts of the economy. So the third relates to international coordination. How is this going to work when we have two major central banks, two polar opposites, each with their own mandates and objectives, two contrasting and potentially contesting, competing views of the world? How is that international coordination, which is so imperative in that future of volatility, going to work? Now, international cooperation was very much the aspiration of the Bretton Woods system, the earlier parts of the flexible exchange rate regime, the G7, Plaza Accord. But that discussion has largely fallen off the stage, but needs to crucially return. So this century, the financial history is likely going to be written by China. It's important to recognize the positive aspects. Where there's a deficit in aggregate demand, China can be a source of that anchor. It's already doing so as it imports more and more over time. It will be a provider of global financial liquidity in times of financial crisis, and it can act as an additional source of diversification for global portfolios, currency, and potentially reserve currency, as Emmanuel has mentioned. So it's important to recognize that, but we should also be keenly aware that a more liberal China can also mean a more volatile world economy. Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks.
Thank you, Keyu, very much. You're taking us in all different directions, each of you. And Keyu, you sort of took us into the 21st century way ahead and told us that the financial history of the 21st century would be written by China if the rest of the world was ready. I'm exaggerating just a bit, but so what will it take for the rest of the world to be ready?
Well, first, I would say that the recommendations that we give to China for financial liberalization and integration, if it's a combination of too hasty, too intense, and too ill-prepared on China's side, then the result is more volatility. And I think in some way it converges with what Emmanuel was saying from different angles, that we're likely going to see volatility in the transition. The second is emerging markets, larger share of the world economy. China and emerging markets are inextricably linked. We see that also with Ricardo's presentation, that there's a gap for global financial liquidity to be provided to emerging markets. China is doing some part of that job already, but needs to do more and potentially work with IMF, because the US arranges only with the 6 industrial countries.
And would you say that those links with emerging markets are independent from geographical locations?
Of course, China trades a lot in its region, but also the Belt Road Initiative is the purpose of that is to span across continents. And so that influence would be more. I think from China's side, the argument that's been floating around is fix your domestic financial system first and then open up. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to work. Why? Because it takes 100 years to build sound capital markets. Even if China's GDP have grown so much, and at that pace, there are a lot of things have lagged behind. It won't grow and evolve equally fast, like the people, like the institutions, like the capital markets. And today, 70% of investors are still retail investors. And the saying goes, you would have lost all your money if you were a value trader, investor in China. So all these things take time to change.
So what you're saying is that to avoid the extreme volatility of a difficult transition, number one is going to take time. Number two is going to be a factor of what policy advice, how China is actually part and parcel of the overall system with good cooperation rather than confrontation.
Let me just add that selective opening up is important. China needs to improve the transparency of its framework, monetary framework, exchange rate framework, enhance communication. That would help it accelerate towards that equilibrium where there's less volatility, but that needs to improve.
Right. You know, you take me back to a few years when we had that very intensive discussion with the Chinese authorities, particularly the People's Bank of China, when the renminbi was eventually at the end of that annual process, which was laborious on both sides and required a lot of cooperation, when the renminbi was included in the basket of currencies that actually determined the value of the SDR. And yes, the efforts was on transparency, on gradual, on opening up at a pace that was compatible with stability at home. Exactly. I was intrigued by one of your comments, actually. Did you say that the less transparency, the more scrutiny?
I said that the more opening up, the more discipline on transparency, forcing central banks to work normally.
Okay, all right. And what happens if we do not get ready for that? If what you're saying actually doesn't happen, because confrontation prevails, and instead of this age of ingenuity that I would call for, we have the age of anger.
We've already seen in the last couple of years that policy errors can really magnify the economic distortions, dislocations as seen by the trade war. The next one could be the financial system and its travails. And so I think with the geopolitical tensions, can the IMF play a role in somehow intermediating, easing the concerns, helping with coordination, will be very important. Otherwise, we're going to see more volatility. And as I mentioned, China is only partially integrated, and we're already feeling it through financial markets for every little turbulence that happens there.
Right. And everybody has to lose in that volatility phase. That's true.
For reserves.
Okay. If I couple what you just said about the euro and what Keyu was saying about the China and the time that it takes to build a capital market, does that mean between the two of you that the renminbi will be a currency of reserve in yet a few more decades, or do you see a situation where that movement could be accelerated?
I think that the stability of the currency is actually more important than a floating currency that's highly volatile. Bitcoin is never going to really make a currency of that if the price changes every day. So I think that with transparency, as I mentioned, with better communication and with very transparent exchange rate mechanism, but more stability, I think that can actually enhance and maybe accelerate the international role that the currency can play. And I do also think that a diversified system would be better once we reach that equilibrium. But it could happen sooner than the full capital markets is developed, which takes time.
Right. Okay. We have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to ask each of you in turn to take at least 30 seconds. We we can have an extra 2 minutes. But take a little bit of time to tell me what you think is the biggest challenge that we IMF should focus on. We assume we still have the same mission, the same mandate. We are concerned about financial stability. We are concerned about prosperity. trade is one of the key instruments that can fuel that in particular. In that changing landscape that we have, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge and where we should focus on? Keyu.
I want to raise a question, hopefully not too subversive, but I think we need to really think clearly about financial integration, financial capital flows. It's not a win-win situation. Even with trade, where there are clear benefits, we've had discussions about inequality and the critical effect in shaping populism today. We need to have the same discussion about financial globalization. The costs are pretty clear. The volatile capital flows, the sudden stops, the fact that it's caused a lot of emerging market crises, the moral hazard behavior in terms of the financial sector, investment banks, even giving way to corrupt officials, being able to exploit more of their country's resources. These are very real. And the kind of things that I mentioned, where more financial integration could be more volatility in the world, these are also very real. And again, the dichotomy between the elites and the people in the discussion that has been so featured in terms of trade has to be brought up in terms of financial globalization. The benefits of this, which has been accrued a lot to industrial countries, may not be, the same experience may not be replicated for emerging markets. And therefore, I think we need to step back and also think more, once again, about this fundamental question.
You know, it's music to my ears, because under the leadership of some of our directors here, Gita Gopina is here, and many others in the room. This is actually something that we are looking at. And David Lipton, who is working together with me on the management team, is also very interested in that project, looking at those capital flows movements with a view to integrating from a multidisciplinary approach those policies. So more to come. And as you probably have heard as well, we have a framework on corruption and governance that is going to lead us to being far more analytical and intrusive at the same time, with diagnosis and recommendations because of the importance of the matter.